village of St. Mary Mead had settled into that particular rhythm of a warm June afternoon that suggested all was right with the world. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the dappled shade of Mrs. Bantry's prize-winning pergola, observed the gentle social ballet unfolding around her with the quiet satisfaction of one who had witnessed such scenes countless times before. The annual Rose Society tea was proceeding with the measured grace that characterized all proper village gatherings, conversations flowing like honey, the gentle clink of china against china providing a delicate percussion to the afternoon symphony. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, resplendent in a frock of pale yellow that complemented both her complexion and her prized climbing roses, moved among her guests with the practiced ease of a hostess who understood that successful entertaining required the lightest of touches. "More tea, Miss Marple?" she inquired, the silver pot poised elegantly in her capable hands. "Cook has outdone herself with the cucumber sandwiches today." Miss Marple accepted the offered refreshment with a gentle smile, her keen blue eyes taking in the assembled company over the rim of her delicate spode cup. There was Colonel Melchett, the local magistrate, deep in animated discussion with Dr. Haydock about the disappointing performance of the county cricket team. Near the rose arbor, Mrs. Price Ridley held court with several of the younger wives, her voice carrying just enough to suggest that the topic under discussion was of the sort that required careful modulation. The vicar, Reverend Clement, stood somewhat apart with his wife Griselda, his scholarly demeanor suggesting he was mentally composing Sunday's sermon even as he nodded politely at Mrs. Weatherby's enthusiastic discourse on the challenges of maintaining delphiniums. It was precisely the sort of afternoon that reminded Miss Marple why she had chosen to make her home in St. Mary Mead. The gentle predictability of it all, the way each person played their appointed role in the village's ongoing drama, provided a comfort that she had come to treasure in her advancing years. Yet even as she savored this moment of contentment, her observant nature noted the small discordancies that always existed beneath the surface of such gatherings. Young Mrs. Carmichael, for instance, kept glancing toward the lane as if expecting someone who had not yet arrived. Her fingers worried at the handle of her teacup in a manner that suggested anxiety rather than mere impatience. Mr. Alistair Finch, the church warden, stood near the garden gate with an expression of barely concealed irritation, consulting his pocket watch with the frequency of a man who had somewhere else he would rather be. Most intriguingly, Mrs. Bantry herself seemed unusually animated, her laughter perhaps a note too bright, her attention to her guests just a fraction too intense. "Such a lovely afternoon for it," remarked Miss Hartnell, settling her considerable frame into the wicker chair beside Miss Marple. "Though I must say, Dolly seems rather on edge today. Have you noticed?" Miss Marple had indeed noticed, but she merely smiled and murmured something appropriately non-committal. In her experience, the most interesting revelations came not from direct inquiry, but from patient observation. She had learned long ago that people revealed their true natures most clearly when they believed themselves unobserved. The afternoon continued its gentle progression. Conversations meandered through the familiar territories of weather, gardens, and the minor scandals that provided the lifeblood of village discourse. Miss Marple found herself drawn into a discussion about the upcoming church fete with Mrs. Clement, while keeping one ear attuned to Colonel Melchett's increasingly heated opinions about modern policing methods. It was all wonderfully, reassuringly ordinary, until it wasn't. At precisely 20 minutes past 4, just as Mrs. Bantry was preparing to unveil her famous Victoria sponge, the tranquil afternoon was shattered by a sound that seemed to tear through the very fabric of the peaceful scene. The church bells, which should have remained silent until the evening service, suddenly burst into a wild, discordant clanging that bore no resemblance to any proper peal. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Conversations ceased mid-sentence, teacups rattled against saucers, and every head turned toward the church spire visible beyond the garden wall. The bells continued their frantic tolling, not the measured, joyous sound of celebration, nor the solemn cadence of mourning, but something altogether more desperate and chaotic. Miss Marple set down her cup with deliberate care, her eyes moving swiftly across the assembled company. Mrs. Bantry had gone quite pale, one hand pressed to her throat in a gesture that spoke of genuine shock rather than mere surprise. Mr. Finch had started forward, his face a mask of outrage and concern. "Good God," he muttered, his usual composure entirely abandoned. "Someone's in my bell tower, but who would dare—" The clanging stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving behind a silence that seemed even more ominous than the cacophony had been. In that moment of profound quiet, Miss Marple noticed several things that would later prove significant. The way Mrs. Carmichael's hand trembled as she set down her cup, the sharp intake of breath from Dr. Haydock, and most particularly the expression of what could only be described as relief that flickered across Mrs. Bantry's features before being quickly suppressed. "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested in her gentle voice, "we should go and see if assistance is needed." The suggestion galvanized the group into action. Led by Colonel Melchett and Mr. Finch, the garden party guests began making their way toward the church, their festive afternoon transformed into something altogether more serious. As they walked, Miss Marple found herself beside Mrs. Bantry, who seemed to be struggling to maintain her composure. "My dear Dolly," Miss Marple said quietly, "you look rather shaken. Are you quite all right?" Mrs. Bantry's laugh was brittle, unconvincing. "Oh, it's nothing, Jane. Just the shock of it all. Those bells. They sounded so frantic, didn't they?" Miss Marple noted the word choice, filing it away along with the observation that Mrs. Bantry's eyes avoided hers as she spoke. In her long experience of human nature, she had learned that the most revealing moments often came in the immediate aftermath of shock, when people's carefully constructed facades cracked just enough to let the truth peek through. As they approached the church, the heavy oak door stood slightly ajar, unusual for a weekday afternoon when no service was scheduled. The interior was cool and dim after the bright sunlight of the garden, and it took a moment for their eyes to adjust. When they did, the scene that greeted them would be etched into their memories forever. At the base of the narrow stone steps that led to the bell tower, a figure lay crumpled and still. Even from a distance, there was no mistaking the unnatural angle of the limbs, the terrible stillness that spoke of death. Dr. Haydock pushed forward immediately, his medical training overriding social protocol, but Miss Marple could see from his expression that there was nothing to be done. "It's Leonard Thorne," someone whispered, and the name rippled through the assembled villagers like a stone thrown into still water. Leonard Thorne, the church organist, a man who had served St. Mary Mead's musical needs for nearly 15 years with quiet dedication. A man who, by all accounts, had no business being in the bell tower on a Tuesday afternoon. A man who, Miss Marple noted with her characteristic attention to detail, lay with one hand still bearing the distinctive rope burn that spoke of a final, desperate struggle with forces beyond his control. The discovery of Leonard Thorne's body transformed the peaceful church interior into a scene of barely controlled chaos, though the sort of restrained English chaos that manifested itself in hushed whispers rather than outright hysteria. Dr. Haydock knelt beside the still form, his weathered hands moving with professional efficiency as he conducted his preliminary examination, while Colonel Melchett took charge of the situation with the natural authority of a man accustomed to command. After several tense minutes, Dr. Haydock rose with the grave expression of a man who had seen too much death to find it anything but sobering, confirming what they all feared. Leonard Thorne was beyond help. The rope burns on his hands suggested he had been pulling the bell ropes when whatever happened occurred, which explained the wild pealing that had interrupted their garden party, though the exact circumstances of his fall down the stone steps remained disturbingly unclear. Miss Marple positioned herself, near the baptismal font, a vantage point that allowed her to observe both the scene around poor Mr. Thorne and the reactions of her fellow villagers with equal clarity, noting how Mrs. Bantry's earlier pallor had deepened and how Mrs. Carmichael stood frozen near the door as if debating whether to flee entirely. As the initial shock began to settle into the more complex emotions that follow unexpected tragedy, the villagers naturally gravitated toward the comfort of speculation and theory. Mrs. Price Ridley, ever eager to establish herself as the coordinator of information, moved from group to group with efficient purposefulness, declaring that nothing so dreadful had occurred since the great blizzard and that it must surely have been a terrible accident. Poor Leonard was always rather clumsy, wasn't he? She whispered loudly enough for half the church to hear, though this charitable assessment was quickly challenged by Miss Hartnell, who pointed out that clumsy or not, who climbs into a bell tower on a Tuesday afternoon without good reason? The question of what had brought Leonard Thorne to the church at this particular time hung in the air like incense, particularly troubling since Mrs. Weatherby, whose knowledge of village schedules was encyclopedic, confirmed that he had no business being there. His usual practice sessions were Thursday evenings and Sunday mornings, and the bell ropes were typically secured after use. Young Mrs. Clement, standing protectively beside her husband, suggested with morbid fascination that perhaps Leonard had been meeting someone, which sparked a flurry of excited whispers about secret rendezvous and bachelor mysteries, while Reverend Clement himself looked utterly lost, his usual composure shattered by this violent intrusion into his sacred space. The arrival of Inspector Slack from Much Benham brought a different energy to the proceedings, his brisk efficiency and barely concealed impatience with village ways, creating immediate tension with the more measured pace of rural investigation. Miss Marple had encountered Inspector Slack on previous occasions and had formed a clear impression of his methods, which favored quick resolution over thorough examination and showed little patience for the subtle complexities of human motivation. His preliminary assessment was delivered with characteristic bluntness. A man goes up to the bell tower for unknown reasons, probably slips, hits his head, and the frantic bell ringing was either a last-ditch effort for help or simply panic-induced flailing. "Seems open and shut to me," he declared to Constable Polk, who diligently scribbled notes, while the inspector's gaze swept over the assembled villagers with a sort of professional suspicion that suggested he considered them all potential obstacles to his efficient conclusion. When Dr. Haydock respectfully pointed out the distinctive rope burns that suggested a struggle or forceful grip during the fall, Slack merely waved a dismissive hand, insisting that panic could explain anything and that village folk had a tendency to complicate simple accidents with their overactive imaginations. However, Inspector Slack's pronouncement, far from settling the matter, merely fueled the fire of village theorizing and revealed the complex web of relationships that lay beneath St. Mary Mead's placid surface. The inspector's methodical questioning established that while the church remained unlocked during daylight hours, access to the bell tower required a key held by either Mr. Finch as church warden or Reverend Clement, both of whom accounted for their whereabouts during the relevant period and could produce their keys upon request. Leonard Thorne himself possessed no such key, which raised the uncomfortable question of how he had gained access to the tower in the first place, unless someone had provided it or left the door unlocked contrary to usual practice. Mrs. Bantry, when questioned about the garden party timeline, provided detailed accounts with her usual efficiency, though Miss Marple noted that her friend's composure seemed somewhat strained, and that her earlier shock was giving way to a kind of brittle energy that suggested she was working very hard to maintain her calm facade. The revelation that Leonard had been a reliable and conscientious organist, well liked by most of the congregation and without obvious enemies, only deepened the mystery of what had brought him to such an unusual and ultimately fatal location on this particular afternoon. As the official investigation proceeded with its pedestrian thoroughness, Miss Marple found herself paying particular attention to the subtle dynamics emerging among the assembled villagers, those small behavioral details that others dismissed as mere shock or grief. Mrs. Carmichael, who had seemed so anxious during the garden party, now appeared almost relieved, as if Leonard Thorne's death had somehow resolved a source of concern rather than creating a new tragedy, while Mr. Finch's earlier irritation had evolved into focused determination to understand how his carefully maintained security procedures had been circumvented. Most intriguingly, several of the women had begun developing increasingly elaborate theories about Leonard's private life, transforming his quiet bachelor existence into something far more mysterious and potentially scandalous than the evidence warranted. Mrs. Price Ridley whispered about possible romantic entanglements, while others speculated about family secrets or financial difficulties, each theory revealing more about the theorist's own preoccupations than about poor Leonard's actual circumstances. Miss Marple observed these reactions with her characteristic patience, understanding that in the immediate aftermath of violent death, people often revealed their true natures more clearly than they intended, and that the most important clues frequently lay not in what was said, but in what remained, carefully unspoken. The afternoon stretched toward evening, with the investigation settling into routine procedures and the villagers gradually dispersing to spread the news throughout St. Mary Mead, but Miss Marple remained troubled by several details that seemed to resist the simple explanation everyone preferred. The frantic, unnatural ringing of the bells continued to bother her. It suggested intent rather than accident, a desperate message or perhaps even a deliberate act that had ended in disaster. She remembered Mrs. Bantry's fleeting expression of relief when the bells fell silent, Mrs. Carmichael's trembling hand at the tea table, and the way several people had glanced toward the lane as if expecting someone who never arrived. These were not the reactions of people merely witnessing a tragic accident, but rather the subtle tells of deeper currents, of hidden anxieties and unacknowledged connections that would require careful unraveling. As she finally made her way home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected that while Inspector Slack might be satisfied with his straightforward explanation, the village of St. Mary Mead had just witnessed something far more complex and potentially sinister than a simple fall from a bell tower, and that somewhere among the shocked faces and carefully constructed alibis lay the truth about why Leonard Thorne had died alone in that ancient tower. His final act, the desperate ringing of bells that had shattered the peace of a perfect English afternoon. The morning after Leonard Thorne's death broke with a pale, reserved sunshine that seemed to acknowledge the gravity of what had transpired, as if even the weather understood that exuberance would be inappropriate in a village grappling with sudden tragedy. St. Mary Mead woke to the low hum of gossip transmitted from gate to gate, a carefully orchestrated symphony of speculation that reached every kitchen before breakfast was properly cleared away, transforming the usual gentle rhythm of village life into something more urgent and purposeful. Miss Marple, who had never found Inspector Slack's pronouncements of open and shut cases particularly satisfactory, donned her neat grey cardigan and took a deliberate turn about the village, with the unhurried determination of someone who appeared to be going nowhere in particular, yet somehow contrived to arrive precisely where observation would prove most fruitful. The high street buzzed with the kind of intense activity that only occurred when genuine drama had disrupted the established order, with small groups forming and dissolving outside the post office, baker's shop, and Mrs. Hartwell's general store. As information was shared, theories debated, and the comfortable boundaries of normal conversation temporarily suspended in favor of more pressing concerns. At the post office, Miss Marple found Mrs. Hartwell presiding over both the mail and the village's most reliable information exchange with her. Characteristic efficiency, understanding instinctively that knowledge represented power, and timing meant everything in the delicate social ecosystem of St. Mary Mead. The shop was unusually crowded for a Wednesday morning, with several customers who clearly had no postal business lingering near the counter in hopes of gleaning fresh details about the previous day's tragic events, their presence creating an atmosphere of barely suppressed excitement beneath the veneer of appropriate solemnity. Mrs. Hartwell, never one to disappoint her audience, was holding forth about Leonard Thorne's character with the authority of someone who had observed him purchasing stamps and posting letters for the better part of 15 years, noting with particular emphasis that he had always been punctual with his correspondence, posting a letter every Thursday without fail, regular as clockwork, though she had never seen the address clearly, since he kept it turned away from the counter in a manner that seemed oddly secretive for a man with nothing apparent to hide. This revelation sparked immediate interest among her listeners, particularly Mrs. Price Ridley, who wondered aloud whether Leonard might have been conducting some sort of clandestine correspondence that could explain his presence in the bell tower, while young Mrs. Clement suggested with barely contained excitement that perhaps he had been involved in romantic intrigue that had ended in disaster. The conversation revealed several details that had not emerged during Inspector Slack's perfunctory questioning, most notably Mrs. Hartwell's recollection that Leonard had seemed unusually agitated during his last visit the previous Friday, purchasing not his customary single stamp, but an entire book, suggesting either increased correspondence or preparation for future needs that would never be fulfilled. More significantly, she remembered his specific inquiries about postal timing, particularly whether letters posted Tuesday afternoon would reach their destinations by Wednesday morning, questions that struck her as peculiar since Leonard had never previously shown interest in postal schedules, his routine having been as predictable as the church bells themselves. Miss Marple absorbed this information with characteristic quiet attention, recognizing that each detail suggested Leonard Thorne's death had not been the random accident Inspector Slack preferred to believe, but rather the culmination of some planned action or anticipated event that had gone tragically awry, transforming the image of the quiet organist frantically pulling bell ropes in his final moments into something far more purposeful and desperate. Her next destination was the vicarage, where she found Reverend Clement in his study, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of sermon preparation, though his usual scholarly focus seemed notably absent as he stared toward the church spire, with profound bewilderment etched across his gentle features. Griselda. Clement welcomed Miss Marple with obvious relief, clearly grateful for any distraction from the morning's grim preoccupations, and quickly launched into her own analysis with the enthusiasm of someone who had spent considerable time developing theories about their deceased neighbor's final hours. The conversation revealed that Leonard had approached Reverend Clement several weeks earlier with questions about church history, particularly regarding the bell tower's construction and original purpose, inquiries that had seemed like innocent scholarly curiosity at the time, but now appeared potentially significant given the circumstances of his death. More troubling was Griselda's observation that Leonard had seemed increasingly withdrawn during recent weeks, declining social invitations and appearing distracted during choir practice, behavior she had attributed to natural bachelor melancholy, but which now suggested deeper, more troubling concerns that had ultimately led him to that fatal encounter in the ancient stone tower. As Miss Marple made her way through the village, she encountered Mrs. Carmichael near the church gates, the young woman's usual composure replaced by an expression of strain that seemed to encompass more than simple grief for a deceased neighbor. Her gloves impeccable, yet bearing a telltale smudge of gray that reminded Miss Marple of old stone and bell ropes. Their brief conversation revealed Mrs. Carmichael's curious insistence that she had hardly known Leonard Thorne despite his having played at her wedding, a protestation that struck Miss Marple as unnecessarily emphatic, particularly when coupled with the woman's obvious relief when discussing his death rather than his life. The morning's investigations had provided Miss Marple with a clearer picture of Leonard Thorne as a man who had been planning something significant in the weeks before his death, whose usual predictability had given way to mysterious inquiries and secretive behavior, suggesting not a tragic accident but a deliberate action that had ended in disaster, though whether he had been acting alone or in concert with others remained the crucial question that would require her most careful consideration to unravel. The morning of the third day, brought Inspector Slack back to St. Mary Mead with the determined efficiency of a man who preferred his cases resolved with dispatch rather than prolonged village speculation, and he established his temporary headquarters in the church vestry with the sort of methodical precision that suggested he had little patience for the subtle complexities that so often characterized rural investigations. His approach was refreshingly direct after the previous day's gossip and theorizing, focusing on concrete facts rather than psychological speculation. Who possessed keys to the bell tower, who had been present at the crucial time, and most importantly, who might have harbored sufficient animosity toward Leonard Thorne to result in fatal confrontation. The inspector's questions cut through the genteel circumlocution that had characterized much of the village's discussion, demanding precise timelines and specific details rather than the vague impressions and half-remembered conversations that had dominated earlier speculation, though Miss Marple noted from her position near the vestry window that his brusque manner seemed to make witnesses more cautious rather than more forthcoming, as if his impatience actually hindered the very revelations he sought to extract. It was perhaps inevitable that suspicion would crystallize around Mr. Alistair Finch, the church warden whose meticulous attention to church property and obvious distress at the improper bell-ringing made him the most logical suspect in Inspector Slack's systematic analysis of the case. Finch's possession of the bell tower key, combined with his known irritation at any deviation from proper church procedures, provided both opportunity and motive in the inspector's straightforward interpretation of events, while his presence among the first to reach the church after the frantic pealing had ceased suggested either guilty knowledge or suspicious coincidence. Under Slack's relentless questioning, Finch's usual composed demeanor began to crack, revealing beneath his characteristic precision a defensive indignation that seemed to encompass both outrage at being suspected and genuine distress at the tragic outcome of what he insisted had been merely an unfortunate accident born of righteous anger and poor timing. His account, delivered with the strained formality of a man unaccustomed to explaining his actions to authority, described ascending the bell tower stairs with the firm intention of confronting whoever had dared to meddle with the church's sacred instruments. Finding Leonard Thorne in what appeared to be a state of frantic desperation rather than purposeful bell-ringing, and engaging in a heated exchange that had culminated in Leonard's fatal stumble backward down the treacherous stone steps. However, the investigation took an unexpected turn when Mrs. Bantry arrived at the vestry in considerable agitation, clutching a letter that had been delivered by the morning post and bearing Leonard Thorne's distinctive handwriting, postmarked the day before his death, and containing revelations that cast an entirely new light on the organist's final hours. The letter, addressed to Mrs. Bantry in her capacity as president of the Rose Society rather than as a personal friend, contained Leonard's formal resignation from his position as church organist, effective immediately, along with a detailed confession to what he described as borrowing small amounts from the church collection over several months to meet what he termed urgent family obligations that he could not otherwise satisfy. Most significantly, the letter included Leonard's promise to make full restitution and his reference to circumstances beyond my control that had made his position untenable, suggesting not the spontaneous desperation that Inspector Slack's theory required, but rather careful planning and preparation that had somehow gone catastrophically wrong. The existence of this posthumous confession transformed Leonard from victim of circumstance into a man driven by financial desperation and guilt, while raising uncomfortable questions about the timing of his death, whether it had been accidental, suicidal, or something far more sinister that had interrupted his carefully laid plans for confession and restitution. Even more intriguing was the discovery among Leonard's effects of an unfinished letter that spoke cryptically of a matter in conscience connected to the bells, which rang before dawn long ago, and will ring again if I do not find the truth. A reference that immediately sparked recognition among several villagers who recalled mysterious bell sounds at unusual hours over the past months. Incidents that had been dismissed as wind or childish pranks, but now seemed to form a disturbing pattern of nocturnal activity in the church tower. Miss Hartnell remembered an odd single toll at 5 o'clock on a recent Sunday morning, while Mrs. Weatherby admitted to hearing an unmistakable double strike during a winter fog that she had mentioned to no one for fear of ridicule. And even Mr. Finch acknowledged having reprimanded choir boys several summers past, when unexplained ringing had disturbed the village at an unreasonable hour. This pattern of bells before dawn suggested that Leonard's presence in the tower on Tuesday afternoon had not been an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of some ongoing investigation or activity that had required repeated clandestine access to the bell chamber. Though how he had gained such access without keys remained a troubling mystery that Inspector Slack's simple theory could not adequately address. Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by the neat alignment of evidence that seemed to satisfy both Inspector Slack's desire for resolution and the village's appetite for a comprehensible explanation, noting several details that resisted incorporation into the prevailing theory, despite their apparent insignificance to the official investigation. Mr. Finch's indignation, for instance, carried the authentic ring of affronted righteousness rather than guilty panic, while his shoes showed no trace of the stone dust or rope fiber that might be expected from a struggle in the bell tower, and his precise manner of speech suggested a man uncomfortable with deception rather than one practiced in concealing violent acts. More intriguingly, Mrs. Carmichael's behavior continued to suggest anxiety about discovery rather than grief for Leonard's death, her obvious relief at the focus on Mr. Finch seeming inconsistent with innocent concern for a deceased neighbor, while the gray smudge on her glove bore a delicate mesh pattern that resembled old curtain, fabric rather than the coarse weave of bell rope, suggesting contact with some other source entirely. These small discrepancies, dismissed by Inspector Slack as irrelevant to his straightforward interpretation of events, accumulated in Miss Marple's mind like pieces of a puzzle that refused to form the picture everyone expected to see, leading her to suspect that the truth about Leonard Thorne's death lay not in simple confrontation between warden and organist, but in the complex web of secrets and obligations that had driven a quiet man to desperate measures in an ancient bell tower, measures that had somehow attracted the attention of forces more dangerous than mere church authority, and had ultimately cost him his life in ways that the village was only beginning to understand. Inspector Slack's satisfaction with his investigation was evident in the brisk efficiency with which he prepared to conclude the case. His notebook snapped shut with the decisive finality of a man who preferred his mysteries solved rather than prolonged, and his instructions to Constable Polk carried the tone of someone eager to return to Much Benham with another village tragedy neatly categorized and filed away. The inspector's theory had crystallized into conviction overnight, transforming Leonard Thorne from mysterious victim into comprehensible culprit whose guilt over embezzlement had led to fatal confrontation with the vigilant Mr. Finch, a narrative that satisfied both official requirements and village expectations, while requiring no further uncomfortable questions about hidden motives or complex conspiracies. His final interview with Mr. Finch had been conducted with the perfunctory thoroughness of someone confirming details rather than seeking revelations, and the church warden's obvious distress at being suspected of violence had gradually given way to relieved cooperation as it became clear that his role would be viewed as unfortunate accident rather than criminal intent. Miss Marple, however, found herself increasingly troubled by the neat alignment of evidence that seemed almost too convenient in its resolution of every troubling detail, and she made her way to the church once more with the unhurried determination of someone who understood that the most significant truths often resided in the spaces between official conclusions. The morning light filtering through the ancient windows cast familiar shadows across the nave, but today she noticed Mrs. Sims, the church cleaner, kneeling beside the vestry with an expression of focused concentration as she sorted through a collection of leather straps and metal buckles that Miss Marple recognized as the bell mufflers used during funeral services. Mrs. Sims looked up at Miss Marple's approach with the pleased recognition of someone whose work was rarely acknowledged, but whose knowledge of church details was encyclopedic, and her greeting carried the warmth reserved for those who understood the importance of maintaining proper order in sacred spaces. "I do hope I'm not disturbing your work," Miss Marple said gently, noting the careful way Mrs. Sims arranged each piece of equipment with the precision of someone who believed that every item had its proper place and purpose. Mrs. Sims shook her head with obvious pleasure at having an appreciative audience, explaining that she was conducting her monthly inventory of church equipment and had discovered several disturbing irregularities that suggested someone had been interfering with items that should have remained untouched except during official ceremonies. Most significantly, one of the bell mufflers was missing entirely, while another showed signs of hasty repair with ribbon rather than the proper leather thongs, suggesting unauthorized use that had resulted in damage requiring improvised concealment. The conversation revealed details that Inspector Slack's investigation had entirely overlooked, particularly Mrs. Sims's observation that the vestry key cabinet showed fresh scratches around 2 particular hooks, suggesting repeated removal and replacement of keys by someone unfamiliar with their proper handling. More intriguingly, she had discovered evidence that someone had been accessing the church during unauthorized hours, leaving behind traces of their presence in the form of disturbed dust patterns and slightly displaced furniture that spoke of careful but not entirely successful attempts at concealment. Mrs. Sims's sharp eyes had also noted that Mrs. Carmichael had visited the church the previous week to sort charity items from the parish room, requesting string to tie bundles and showing particular interest in the storage areas beneath the main sanctuary, behavior that had seemed innocent at the time but now appeared potentially significant given the circumstances of Leonard's death. Miss Marple's examination of the bell tower entrance revealed additional evidence that challenged Inspector Slack's straightforward interpretation of events, particularly the presence of fine scratches around the lock that suggested someone had used improvised tools rather than proper keys to gain access, marks that were fresh enough to indicate recent activity but subtle enough to escape casual observation. The pattern of scratches was consistent with the use of a thin, rigid implement such as a hatpin or similar tool, suggesting someone with both the knowledge and determination to circumvent official security measures through careful manipulation rather than forceful entry. Most significantly, the door frame showed traces of gray fabric fibers that matched neither Leonard's clothing nor Mr. Finch's usual attire, but bore a striking resemblance to the delicate mesh pattern Miss Marple had observed on Mrs. Carmichael's glove during the garden party. As these details accumulated in Miss Marple's mind like pieces of a puzzle that refused to form the expected picture, she began to understand that Leonard Thorne's presence in the bell tower had been neither accidental nor the result of simple guilt over financial impropriety, but rather part of some larger investigation or confrontation that had attracted the attention of forces more dangerous than church authority. The evidence suggested that Leonard had been documenting or investigating activities that someone was prepared to conceal through violence, transforming his frantic bell-ringing from panic into desperate communication that had been silenced before its message could be properly understood. Mrs. Carmichael's obvious relief at the focus on Mr. Finch, combined with the physical evidence linking her to unauthorized church access, painted a picture of involvement that extended far beyond innocent charity work or casual acquaintance with the deceased organist. The realization that Leonard Thorne had died not as a thief seeking to cover his tracks, but as an honest man pursuing some form of justice fundamentally altered Miss Marple's understanding of the case, suggesting that the true perpetrator remained free and protected by the general assumption that Inspector Slack's investigation had reached satisfactory conclusions. The missing bell muffler, the improvised repairs, and the evidence of unauthorized access all pointed toward a conspiracy that had been operating beneath the surface of village life for some time, using the church itself as both meeting place and repository for activities that required concealment from official scrutiny. Miss Marple understood that she now possessed information that could potentially expose the truth about Leonard's death, But she also recognized that proceeding too quickly or directly might alert those responsible that their carefully constructed deception had been discovered by someone far more observant than they had anticipated, requiring her most delicate maneuvering to ensure that justice would ultimately prevail over the comfortable fiction that the village preferred to embrace. The village of St. Mary Mead had begun to settle into the peculiar rhythm that follows violent death, a cadence marked by hushed conversations and meaningful glances that suggested the official resolution of Leonard Thorne's case had satisfied no one except Inspector Slack himself, and Miss Marple found herself drawn once again into the gentle art of observation that had served her so well in previous encounters with human nature at its most complex and deceptive. Her morning walk took her first to Mrs. Carmichael's neat cottage, where she found the young woman in her garden with an intensity that spoke of desperate activity rather than genuine horticultural interest, her movements quick and nervous as she attacked the flower beds with unnecessary vigor. Miss Marple's casual compliment on the grey curtains visible through the sitting-room window brought an immediate flush to Mrs. Carmichael's cheeks, and her stammered explanation about recent alterations seemed to encompass more anxiety than mere domestic concerns warranted, particularly when Miss Marple noticed the uneven hemming that suggested hasty repair work rather than planned improvement. Inside the cottage, over tea served with trembling hands, Miss Marple observed the small dish of hat pins near the window, one noticeably bent, and another bearing the telltale scratches of having been used for purposes other than securing headwear, while the faint scent of old stone that seemed to cling to Mrs. Carmichael's clothing provided an olfactory connection to the church that no amount of careful washing could entirely eliminate. The conversation revealed far more than Mrs. Carmichael intended, particularly when Miss Marple mentioned in passing the discovery of delicate grey fibers on the bell tower doorframe, a seemingly innocent observation that caused Mrs. Carmichael's teacup to rattle against its saucer with audible distress. Her denial was too swift and too practiced, the words tumbling out with the desperate efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this explanation, but had not anticipated being confronted with physical evidence that contradicted her carefully constructed version of events. More significantly, her repeated insistence that she had hardly known Leonard Thorne rang false in light of her obvious emotional investment in the outcome of the investigation, suggesting a relationship that extended far beyond casual acquaintance and into territory that she was desperately anxious to conceal from official scrutiny. Miss Marple's subsequent visit to the vicarage proved equally illuminating, as Griselda Clement's irrepressible curiosity had uncovered details that Inspector Slack's perfunctory investigation had entirely overlooked, particularly Leonard's intense interest in church history and his specific inquiries about hidden passages and secret compartments that had once served to conceal valuables during times of civil unrest. Reverend Clement's admission that Leonard had borrowed obscure parish records detailing ancient legacies and forgotten endowments painted a picture of systematic research rather than casual historical interest, while his questions about the old crypt suggested he had been pursuing a specific line of investigation that extended far beyond musical matters. Dr. Haydock's reluctant revelation that Leonard had consulted him about symptoms of stress and strain, along with his medical advice to avoid climbing towers and ladders, added poignancy to the tragedy while raising uncomfortable questions about whether Leonard's death had been the accidental result of ignoring medical counsel or something far more sinister. The most significant discovery came through Mrs. Hartwell's encyclopedic memory of postal transactions, which revealed that Leonard had recently sent an unusually heavy and valuable package, insured for a substantial sum and described as containing irreplaceable family heirlooms, a designation that seemed to contradict his alleged embezzlement of church funds while suggesting he possessed items of considerable worth that required protection or removal from St. Mary Mead. This revelation transformed Leonard's posthumous confession from evidence of guilt into potential misdirection, raising the possibility that his admission of financial impropriety had been designed to conceal a more complex truth about his activities and discoveries within the church itself. The careful documentation in his notebook of nocturnal bell sounds, complete with weather conditions and cryptic references to parcels and muffled rings, suggested a pattern of clandestine activity that Leonard had been monitoring with the methodical precision of a man gathering evidence for eventual revelation. Mrs. Bantry's belated admission about the mysterious bicycle near the Lich Gate during the garden party provided another piece of the increasingly complex puzzle, particularly her description of the grey strip fluttering from the handlebars and its disappearance immediately after the bells fell silent, suggesting coordination between Leonard's desperate bell ringing and someone waiting outside the church for a predetermined signal. The missing bell muffler that Mrs. Sims had discovered during her inventory took on new significance in light of these revelations, suggesting it had been used not for funeral services, but to silence unauthorized bell signals during nocturnal activities that required concealment from village scrutiny. Mr. Finch's earlier knowledge of missing alms money and his frustrated attempts at surveillance painted him as a conscientious guardian rather than a guilty party, while his obvious distress at the security breaches spoke to genuine concern for church property rather than criminal involvement. As these details accumulated in Miss Marple's mind like pieces of an increasingly disturbing puzzle, she began to understand that Leonard Thorne's death represented not the tragic end of a guilty man's desperate attempt to conceal his crimes, but rather the deliberate silencing of an honest investigator whose discoveries had threatened someone with far more to lose than mere financial embarrassment. The transformation of Leonard from perpetrator to victim fundamentally altered the nature of the case, suggesting that his killer remained free and protected by the general assumption that Inspector Slack's investigation had reached satisfactory conclusions, while the true conspiracy continued to operate beneath the surface of village life with the confidence that comes from successful deception and the eliminations of inconvenient witnesses to long-buried secrets that were apparently worth killing to protect. The morning of the 5th day brought an unexpected visitor to St. Mary Mead in the form of Mr. Geoffrey Carmichael, whose existence had been mentioned only in passing, and whose sudden appearance at his wife's cottage created ripples of curiosity throughout the village that quickly transformed into waves of genuine alarm when his frantic inquiries revealed that he had not seen his wife for over a week. His explanation to the hastily assembled crowd outside the post office painted a picture of mounting domestic crisis that cast Mrs. Carmichael's recent behavior in an entirely new and troubling light, particularly his account of her increasingly erratic correspondence and her mysterious references to old debts and family obligations that had driven her to seek employment as a church cleaner despite their comfortable financial circumstances. Mr. Carmichael's obvious distress at finding the cottage empty and his wife's personal effects hastily packed suggested not planned departure, but desperate flight, while his discovery of substantial sums withdrawn from their joint banking account over recent weeks indicated preparation for some significant undertaking that had required both secrecy and considerable financial resources. Most significantly, his production of several letters from his wife, written in her careful hand but bearing postmarks from various locations around the countryside, revealed a pattern of deception that suggested she had been creating an elaborate fiction about her whereabouts while remaining in St. Mary Mead to pursue activities that required both concealment and proximity to the church itself. Inspector Slack's return to investigate Mrs. Carmichael's disappearance carried none of his earlier confidence, his methodical questioning revealing gaps in the official investigation that had been obscured by his eagerness to accept simple explanations for complex circumstances. The inspector's examination of the cottage uncovered evidence that Mrs. Carmichael had been conducting extensive research into parish records and property deeds. Her sitting room transformed into a makeshift office containing detailed maps of church grounds and handwritten copies of ancient legal documents that suggested far more sophisticated knowledge of local history than her role as occasional cleaner would require. More disturbing was the discovery of a collection of old keys, carefully labeled and organized, that provided access to various church buildings and storage areas, indicating systematic preparation for activities that extended far beyond authorized cleaning duties. Dr. Haydock's reluctant admission that Mrs. Carmichael had consulted him about symptoms of extreme stress and had requested sleeping medication for what she described as terrible nightmares about bells and darkness provided additional evidence that her involvement in recent events had been both unwilling and deeply traumatic, suggesting coercion rather than voluntary participation in whatever conspiracy had ultimately claimed both her peace of mind and her presence in the village. Miss Marple's careful examination of the evidence revealed several details that challenged the assumption that Mrs. Carmichael's flight represented simple guilt over Leonard Thorne's death, particularly the discovery among her papers of detailed architectural drawings showing hidden passages and concealed chambers within the church structure that corresponded exactly to Leonard's earlier historical research. The drawings bore annotations in 2 different hands, suggesting collaboration between Mrs. Carmichael and Leonard in investigating aspects of church history that someone else was desperately anxious to keep hidden, while the presence of recent soil samples and fabric fragments indicated that their research had progressed from theoretical investigation to practical exploration of the physical spaces described in the ancient documents. Most significantly, Mrs. Carmichael's correspondence revealed her growing fear of someone she referred to only as DB, whose influence she described as reaching into every corner of village life, and whose displeasure she clearly considered potentially fatal, transforming her from willing conspirator into terrified victim whose ultimate disappearance might represent not escape, but elimination by forces more ruthless than anyone in St. Mary Mead had imagined possible. The revelation that Leonard Thorne and Mrs. Carmichael had been working together to investigate hidden aspects of church history fundamentally altered Miss Marple's understanding of recent events, suggesting that Leonard's death had been not accidental confrontation, but deliberate murder designed to silence an investigation that threatened to expose secrets someone was prepared to kill, to protect. The evidence indicated that their research had uncovered something significant enough to warrant systematic intimidation and ultimate elimination of both investigators. While the careful manipulation of evidence to suggest Leonard's guilt in embezzlement represented sophisticated misdirection designed to discredit any discoveries they might have made before their deaths or disappearances. Mrs. Carmichael's obvious terror during their final conversation, combined with her desperate attempts to distance herself from Leonard, now appeared as the desperate behavior of someone caught between competing loyalties and ultimately abandoned by those who had used her knowledge and access for their own purposes, before disposing of her when she became a liability rather than an asset. As the village absorbed the shock of Mrs. Carmichael's disappearance and began to construct new theories to accommodate this latest development, Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that the truth about Leonard's death lay not in simple village drama, but in complex historical secrets that connected present events to past crimes, possibly involving valuable artifacts or hidden wealth that justified murder to protect. The systematic elimination of witnesses and careful manipulation of evidence suggested a conspiracy sophisticated enough to anticipate official reactions while maintaining the appearance of tragic accidents and domestic complications that would satisfy casual investigation without exposing deeper truths. Miss Marple understood that she now faced adversaries intelligent enough to have successfully deceived Inspector Slack while eliminating inconvenient investigators, and that her own growing understanding of their methods might soon make her the next target of forces that had already demonstrated their willingness to kill repeatedly, to protect secrets that lay buried somewhere within the ancient stones and hidden passages of St. Mary Mead's venerable church, secrets that someone with the initials DB considered worth any price to keep forever hidden from official scrutiny and village gossip alike. The morning of the 6th day brought an unexpected discovery that would prove to be the key Miss Marple had been seeking. though it arrived in the most mundane of circumstances, as Mrs. Sims completed her methodical inventory of church property and uncovered a discrepancy that transformed her routine housekeeping into something far more significant. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the vestry, concealed so skillfully that only the most thorough cleaning would reveal it, lay a collection of documents that painted a picture of systematic deception stretching back decades, including detailed architectural drawings of the church's hidden passages and careful inventories of valuable artifacts that had supposedly been returned to their rightful owners after the Napoleonic Wars, but had apparently never left their secret chambers within the ancient stone walls. The papers bore annotations in multiple hands, suggesting a conspiracy that had evolved over generations, with each participant adding their own knowledge to a growing understanding of the church's hidden wealth and the methods required to extract it without detection, while the most recent entries, written in Leonard Thorne's precise script, documented his growing suspicions about systematic theft and his determination to expose the truth regardless of personal consequences. Miss Marple's examination of these revelations, conducted with her characteristic attention to both detail and human psychology, revealed that Leonard's investigation had identified specific discrepancies between official records and the actual contents of the church's concealed chambers, creating irrefutable evidence of theft that someone had been desperate enough to kill to suppress. The historical context was fascinating in its implications, as the documents described how valuable artifacts had been hidden within specially constructed chambers during the war years, with elaborate precautions taken to ensure their safety and eventual return. Yet the careful records showed that while many items had been officially restored to their owners, several of the most valuable pieces had remained within the church structure, gradually forgotten by their original families and transformed from protected treasures into abandoned wealth waiting for someone with sufficient knowledge and determination to claim them. Most significantly, the papers included correspondence with Dawlish and Brandt, ecclesiastical restorers, that revealed how stolen artifacts could be legitimately sold through established dealers who asked no uncomfortable questions about provenance, provided the documentation appeared authentic and the seller possessed appropriate credentials within the church community. The revelation that the mysterious D.B., who had so terrified Mrs. Carmichael, referred not to a person, but to the restoration firm that had been purchasing stolen church artifacts, created a new understanding of the conspiracy's scope and sophistication, suggesting a network that extended far beyond St. Mary Mead into the broader world of ecclesiastical antiquities and private collecting. Leonard's correspondence with the firm, discovered among his effects and initially dismissed as routine church business, now appeared as evidence of his attempt to trace stolen items and gather proof of systematic theft that had been occurring for years under the cover of legitimate restoration work and historical research. Mrs. Carmichael's terror became comprehensible when viewed in this context, as her position as church cleaner had provided both access to the hidden chambers and detailed knowledge of the theft operation, making her simultaneously valuable as an accomplice and dangerous as a potential witness, whose conscience had apparently begun to trouble her as the crimes escalated from simple theft to murder. Miss Marple's growing understanding of the conspiracy's methods led her to realize that the true perpetrator possessed not only detailed knowledge of church history and architecture, but also the social standing and professional credibility necessary to deflect suspicion while coordinating the systematic removal and sale of valuable artifacts over an extended period. The killer's ability to manipulate the official investigation, provide authoritative explanations for inconvenient evidence, and eliminate witnesses through methods that appeared accidental, suggested someone whose position within the community provided perfect cover for criminal activity, while offering access to information about potential threats to the operation. Most troubling was the realization that the conspiracy had operated successfully for years, precisely because it had been directed by someone whose professional authority and social standing made questioning their actions seem both impertinent and unnecessary, allowing systematic crime to masquerade as legitimate community service while generating substantial profits through the careful disposal of stolen treasures. As Miss Marple contemplated the implications of her discoveries, she understood that she now faced an adversary who combined detailed historical knowledge with ruthless determination and years of successful deception, someone who had already demonstrated willingness to kill repeatedly to protect secrets, that had generated substantial wealth through the systematic theft of artifacts that rightfully belonged to the church and its community. The evidence suggested that Leonard Thorne's death had been not accidental confrontation, but deliberate murder designed to silence an investigation that threatened to expose the entire operation, while Mrs. Carmichael's disappearance represented the eliminations of the final witness whose knowledge could connect the thefts to their orchestrator. Miss Marple realized that her own investigation had probably already attracted dangerous attention, and that the true perpetrator's position within village society provided perfect opportunities for monitoring community activities and identifying potential threats to an operation that had successfully masqueraded as legitimate historical research and church restoration for far too long. The time had come for her most delicate maneuvering, as she prepared to expose a conspiracy that reached into the very heart of St. Mary Mead's most trusted institutions, while ensuring that justice would ultimately prevail over the comfortable fiction that had concealed systematic crime beneath the veneer of respectable community service. Miss Marple understood that exposing a killer who possessed both medical authority and years of successful deception would require her most delicate maneuvering, and she spent the morning of the 7th day arranging what appeared to be nothing more than an impromptu tea gathering in her sitting room, though every detail had been calculated with the precision of a chess master positioning pieces for checkmate. Her invitations were casual, yet strategic, suggesting to Dr. Haydock that she wished to consult him about a troubling headache, asking Reverend Clement to bring the old parish inventory for her amusement, and mentioning to Mrs. Bantry that she had discovered some curious papers that might interest the Rose Society's historical committee. The afternoon light filtering through her lace curtains created an atmosphere of gentle domesticity that concealed the deadly serious nature of what she intended to accomplish, while the careful arrangement of Leonard Thorne's recovered documents on her tea table appeared accidental, but had been positioned to catch the light in ways that would make their contents clearly visible to observant eyes. As her guests assembled with the comfortable familiarity of village neighbors gathering for social conversation, Miss Marple served tea with her characteristic attention to everyone's preferences, noting with particular interest Dr. Haydock's relaxed demeanor and easy confidence, the bearing of a man who believed his careful deceptions had successfully weathered the storm of official investigation. Her opening gambit was deceptively simple. A casual mention of the postal difficulties surrounding Leonard's insured package, which she described as containing 2 silver candlesticks engraved with phoenixes rising, watching carefully as she deliberately misidentified the ecclesiastical symbols that had appeared in Leonard's notes. Dr. Haydock's immediate correction revealed knowledge that no casual observer should possess. His confident assertion that the engravings depicted phoenixes rather than pelicans, betraying familiarity with artifacts that had supposedly never left their hiding places within the church's ancient walls. While his subsequent attempt to cover this slip by claiming confusion with another church only emphasized the precision of his initial identification, Miss Marple's gentle persistence in discussing church architecture and hidden chambers gradually revealed the depth of Dr. Haydock's knowledge about matters that should have been outside his professional expertise, particularly when she mentioned the Latin inscription "Reposita" that Leonard had discovered near the crypt entrance. The doctor's sharp intake of breath and his too quick dismissal of such inscriptions as common ecclesiastical decoration suggested intimate familiarity with the church's secret spaces, while his nervous habit of glancing toward his coat, where Miss Marple suspected he kept the tools necessary for his clandestine activities, revealed the automatic responses of someone accustomed to being prepared for hasty departure when situations became dangerous. Most significantly, his immediate recognition and correction of her deliberate mispronunciation of Dawlish and Brant as Dowlish and Brand demonstrated knowledge of the restoration firm that could only come from direct business dealings rather than casual acquaintance with their reputation. The decisive moment came when the church bells began their muffled tolling, the same pattern that had preceded Leonard's desperate final message, and Miss Marple observed Dr. Haydock's involuntary response with the satisfaction of someone whose carefully laid trap had functioned exactly as intended. His immediate recognition of the signal, combined with his instinctive glance toward the window and his barely concealed tension as he waited for an answering bicycle bell that would never come, revealed his role as coordinator of the conspiracy that had operated beneath the village's peaceful surface for years. The doctor's medical authority had provided perfect cover for systematic theft, allowing him to monitor potential threats through his treatment of Leonard's stress symptoms and Mrs. Carmichael's growing anxiety, while his professional standing ensured that his pronouncements about causes of death would be accepted without question, enabling him to murder both investigators while maintaining the fiction that their deaths had resulted from accident and natural causes. Miss Marple's final revelation was delivered with characteristic gentleness. Her observation that Mrs. Sims had discovered evidence of the missing bell muffler and unauthorized access to church storage areas, creating a complete picture of Dr. Haydock's methods that left no room for denial or misdirection. His medical expertise had enabled him to administer substances that created disorientation and weakness, transforming healthy individuals into victims vulnerable to fatal accidents, while his knowledge of human physiology allowed him to ensure that death appeared natural, even under casual examination. The systematic nature of his crimes, from the gradual theft of valuable artifacts to the elimination of witnesses whose conscience or curiosity threatened his operation, revealed a calculating intelligence that had successfully masqueraded as community service while generating substantial profits through the sale of stolen church treasures to the unscrupulous dealers at Dawlish and Brant. As the weight of evidence accumulated, and Dr. Haydock's careful composure finally cracked under the pressure of Miss Marple's quiet but relentless exposition, the transformation from respected village physician to exposed killer was complete. His medical bag no longer a symbol of healing authority, but a repository of tools used for murder and deception. The bells had fallen silent. The expected signal had failed to arrive. The man who had orchestrated Leonard Thorne's death discovered that his carefully constructed web of lies had finally entangled him beyond escape. Caught by the patient observation and gentle wisdom of an elderly spinster who understood that the most dangerous criminals were often those whose position in society provided perfect camouflage for their predatory nature. Miss Marple folded her hands with quiet satisfaction, knowing that justice would finally be served for Leonard Thorne and Mrs. Carmichael, whose pursuit of truth had cost them their lives, but had ultimately led to the exposure of corruption that had festered in the heart of St. Mary Mead's most sacred institution. The confrontation in Miss Marple's sitting room reached its inevitable conclusion as Inspector Slack arrived within minutes of Dr. Haydock's final, desperate attempt to maintain his crumbling facade. The inspector's heavy footsteps on the garden path announcing the end of years of carefully constructed deception that had masqueraded as community service while concealing systematic theft and murder. The scene that greeted Slack was both dramatic and quietly devastating, with Dr. Haydock slumped in the armchair beside Miss Marple's fireplace, his medical bag open on the tea table like an accusation, while the elderly detective sat with characteristic composure, her gentle manner unchanged, despite having just exposed one of the most sophisticated criminal conspiracies St. Mary Mead had ever harbored within its peaceful boundaries. The evidence Miss Marple had so carefully arranged told its story with devastating clarity. Leonard Thorne's recovered documents spread across the table, the gray fabric fiber that matched Mrs. Carmichael's curtains, and most damning of all, the contents of Dr. Haydock's medical bag, which revealed not instruments of healing but tools of deception and death that had enabled years of successful crime under the perfect cover of medical authority and social respectability. Inspector Slack's methodical examination of the bag's contents provided the concrete proof that transformed Miss Marple's psychological insights into legal evidence, each item a testament to Dr. Haydock's systematic approach to crime and his exploitation of every aspect of his professional position to facilitate theft and murder. The length of narrow leather bearing distinctive staining from bell tower soot revealed how he had repaired the stolen muffler with materials from his surgery, while the envelope from Dawlish and Brant, acknowledging receipt of 2 medieval bosses, St. Mary Mead, authenticity attested, provided irrefutable documentation of his trafficking in stolen church artifacts over an extended period. Most chilling was the discovery of the glass phial labeled antipyrin alongside a coil of slender wire and a steel hatpin bent at its tip, instruments that had enabled him to administer disorienting substances to his victims while creating the physical evidence necessary to stage their deaths as accidents, transforming his medical expertise from healing art into methodical murder that had claimed both Leonard Thorne and the unfortunate Mrs. Carmichael. Dr. Haydock's confession, extracted through Miss Marple's gentle but implacable questioning, revealed the full scope of his crimes and the psychological journey from respected physician to calculating killer whose moral corruption had begun with financial pressure, but had evolved into something far more sinister and systematic. His initial discovery of forgotten artifacts during routine church maintenance had seemed like providential solution to mounting debts, but the ease with which valuable items could be converted into substantial sums through the unscrupulous dealers at Dawlish and Brant had gradually transformed occasional theft into regular income that supported a lifestyle beyond his legitimate means, while funding what he rationalized as necessary improvements to village medical care. The conspiracy had required careful coordination with Mrs. Carmichael, whose position as church cleaner provided access to the hidden chambers, but her growing conscience and increasing anxiety about their activities had made her a liability that Dr. Haydock had been prepared to eliminate with the same clinical detachment he applied to all his medical procedures, viewing murder as simply another form of treatment for problems that threatened his carefully constructed operation. The revelation of Mrs. Carmichael's ultimate fate provided perhaps the most tragic aspect of the case, as the subsequent search of the church's ancient burial chambers, conducted under Miss Marple's careful direction, uncovered evidence that the young woman's disappearance had indeed been permanent, her body concealed in one of the forgotten crypts where Dr. Haydock had calculated it would remain undiscovered until the building itself crumbled into ruin. His medical expertise had enabled him to administer a fatal dose of morphine disguised as treatment for her anxiety, ensuring her death appeared natural while eliminating the final witness whose knowledge could connect him to years of systematic theft and the murder of Leonard Thorne, whose desperate bell-ringing had been his final attempt to summon help that arrived too late to save either himself or his collaborator in the pursuit of justice. The bicycle Mrs. Bantry had observed near the Lich Gate had been Dr. Haydock's means of transporting evidence and coordinating the timing of his crimes, the gray fabric strip serving as a signal system that had operated successfully for months until Leonard's investigation had threatened to expose the entire operation and forced the doctor to resort to increasingly desperate measures to protect his secrets. The formal arrest proceeded with the quiet dignity that characterized all of Inspector Slack's better moments, his earlier confidence replaced by a chastened humility as he recognized how thoroughly Dr. Haydock's social position and professional authority had blinded the official investigation to evidence that Miss Marple's patient observation had ultimately revealed. The recovery of stolen artifacts from various hiding places throughout the village, including several valuable pieces concealed beneath the coal bunker at the surgery, and the missing bell muffler ingeniously reworked into a strap for surgical instruments, provided tangible proof of crimes that had generated substantial wealth through the systematic exploitation of trust and tradition that formed the foundation of village life. The correspondence with Dawlish and Brandt, discovered among Dr. Haydock's personal papers, revealed a network of deception that extended far beyond St. Mary Mead into the broader world of ecclesiastical antiquities, where unscrupulous dealers facilitated the transformations of stolen treasures into legitimate profits through carefully forged documentation and the exploitation of collectors who preferred not to ask uncomfortable questions about provenance. The aftermath of Dr. Haydock's exposure settled over St. Mary Mead with a profound sense of betrayal that penetrated every aspect of village life, transforming familiar routines and trusted relationships into sources of uncertainty and doubt that would require years to fully heal. The funerals for Leonard Thorne and Mrs. Carmichael, conducted together as the village preferred, provided an opportunity for collective mourning and the beginning of a healing process that would necessarily be slow and difficult, while the gradual return of stolen artifacts to their rightful owners or appropriate museums offered tangible evidence that justice, however delayed, had ultimately prevailed over deception and greed. Reverend Clement's patient work of restitution, tracing families named in ancient inventories and writing careful letters of explanation about objects once hidden for safety and now restored with honor, demonstrated the village's commitment to making amends for violations of trust that had occurred within their most sacred institution, while Mr. Finch's meticulous repair of the damaged key cabinet, deliberately leaving a single tiny mark as a reminder that vigilance must begin with attention to small details, symbolized the community's determination to prevent such betrayal from occurring again. Miss Marple's final reflection on the case, conducted in the quiet of her garden as the church bells resumed their proper rhythm under new management, encompassed both satisfaction at justice served and profound sadness at the human cost of crimes that had perverted healing into harm and transformed trust into a weapon for exploitation. The case had demonstrated once again her fundamental understanding that the most dangerous criminals were often those whose position in society provided perfect camouflage for their predatory nature, while the systematic elimination of witnesses and careful manipulation of evidence had revealed the sophisticated intelligence that made such deceptions possible over extended periods. As she observed the gradual return of normalcy to village life, marked by the resumption of garden parties and the slow restoration of easy conversation, Miss Marple reflected that, while the immediate crisis had passed, the deeper lessons about human nature and the fragility of trust would endure long after the specific details of Dr. Haydock's crimes had faded from daily memory, serving as a permanent reminder that even in the most peaceful corners of the world, the eternal struggle between good and evil continued to play out in ways both subtle and profound, requiring constant vigilance and the gentle wisdom that comes from patient observation of the human heart in all its complexity. The weeks following Dr. Haydock's arrest brought to St. Mary Mead the peculiar quality that Miss Marple had observed in other villages touched by violent revelation, a heightened awareness of mortality and deception that manifested itself in the careful way neighbors now observed each other and the deliberate politeness that replaced easy familiarity. The arrival of Dr. Morrison from Much Benham to assume temporary medical duties created its own delicate adjustments as villagers found themselves explaining symptoms to a stranger whose professional competence they did not question, but whose character remained untested by the intimate knowledge that comes only through years of shared experience. Inspector Slack, who had never apologized to anyone if a memorandum could suffice, contrived a stiff little note to Miss Marple acknowledging her assistance, and when he delivered it in person, he looked past her geraniums as though conversation with flowers were safer than examining his own professional shortcomings. The trial proceedings at the county court attracted considerable attention from both local residents and the broader ecclesiastical community. as the case represented not merely individual criminality, but systematic betrayal of the trust that formed the foundation of church-community relationships throughout rural England. Dr. Haydock's defense, conducted by counsel who clearly recognized the hopelessness of their position, focused primarily on financial pressure and mental deterioration rather than denying the essential facts that Miss Marple's investigation had so thoroughly established. The prosecution's methodical presentation revealed the calculating intelligence that had characterized years of successful deception, including the doctor's exploitation of his medical authority to monitor potential threats while administering substances designed to create the vulnerability that had made his victims susceptible to fatal accidents. The systematic nature of these medical murders, combined with his careful manipulation of evidence to suggest natural or accidental death, transformed him from respected community leader into something far more sinister than anyone had imagined possible. Mrs. Bantry threw herself into organizing memorial services for Leonard Thorne and Mrs. Carmichael with the determined energy of someone seeking to restore order through proper ceremony, her meticulous attention to flowers and music serving as both tribute to the deceased and assertion that civilized behavior would ultimately triumph over chaos. The investigation into Dr. Haydock's financial records had uncovered transactions totaling several £1,000s over 5 years, money that had funded not only an extravagant lifestyle, but also careful investments designed to create the appearance of legitimate prosperity while concealing criminal sources. The correspondence with Dawlish and Brant proved particularly damaging, revealing sophisticated methods used to create false provenance for stolen artifacts through carefully forged documentation and the exploitation of dealers who preferred profitable transactions to uncomfortable questions about ownership. Perhaps the most poignant discovery emerged from Leonard's effects with the respectful slowness due to last wishes. A letter addressed to a sister in Devon enclosing a modest bank draft and instructions for the sale of certain music books, along with the receipt for his insured parcel which, when traced, yielded a plain wooden box containing the candlesticks he had rescued for the church rather than stolen from it. Reverend Clement placed them on the altar the following Sunday with composure that trembled only once, and Griselda observed afterward that if ever there were proof that symbols could be misread, it was that a bird feeding its young should be mistaken for a phoenix, though perhaps both were apt. The restoration of stolen artifacts to their rightful places within the church became a community project that provided both practical purpose and psychological healing, with volunteers working under careful supervision to catalogue recovered items, while creating new security measures designed to prevent future exploitation of the building's architectural secrets. The village's routines gradually resumed their outward forms, though they carried an inescapable undercurrent of awareness that would never entirely fade. The Monday market still bustled, but the easy camaraderie among vendors and shoppers bore the subtle marks of experience, each interaction now informed by deeper understanding of how thoroughly appearance could mask reality. Mrs. Price Ridley, whose earlier theories had been so confidently shared, found her usual pronouncements tempered by newfound humility, while Mr. Finch resumed his duties with the gravity of a man who had seen the lock on his own assumptions and found it wanting. The bell tower, once a benign architectural feature, had become a monument to the village's education in the complexities of human nature, its proper evening tolling now carrying both memorial and promise that vigilance would be eternal companion to trust. Miss Marple observed this slow, painful transition from her garden with the quiet satisfaction of someone who understood that healing, like justice, required patience and wisdom rather than haste. She reflected on Leonard and Mrs. Carmichael, on the ways communities misread the timid and the noisy, and she was not surprised to discover that what endured most sharply were not the violences, but the courtesies, the careful notes about choir practice, the neat lists of hymn numbers, the anxious gratitude of a young woman who had wanted, in the end, only to set something right. The case had demonstrated once again her fundamental understanding that the most dangerous criminals were often those whose position in society provided perfect camouflage for predatory nature, while the systematic elimination of witnesses revealed the sophisticated intelligence that made such deceptions possible over extended periods. As autumn settled over St. Mary Mead with its familiar rhythm of harvest celebrations and preparation for winter, the gradual restoration of normal social interactions suggested that time would eventually heal the wounds that betrayal had inflicted, but the deeper understanding would remain as permanent legacy. The church bells, ringing with proper dignity under new supervision, no longer carried the desperate urgency that had marked Leonard Thorne's final message, but their measured tolling served as daily reminder that vigilance and wisdom must guard community values against those who would corrupt them for personal advantage. The organ bench did not remain empty long, a young man from Much Benham with earnest demeanor and lyrical touch taking up the position, and when he played the evening service, the choir boys stood straighter, for music, like truth, asks us to lift our chins and face what must be faced with courage and grace. Winter settled over St. Mary Mead with the gentle persistence of accumulated wisdom, bringing with it the pale clarity that sometimes reveals what summer's warmth had allowed to blur, and Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the peculiar quality that touched villages after they had faced their darkest possibilities and emerged with deeper understanding of both human frailty and the enduring strength that comes from confronting truth, however painful its revelations might prove to be. The trial's conclusion in late November had brought formal closure, with Dr. Haydock sentenced to life imprisonment for the murders of Leonard Thorne and Mrs. Carmichael, along with additional penalties for theft and fraud that ensured he would never again exploit the medical authority he had so thoroughly corrupted, while the judge's particularly pointed remarks about crimes committed by those in positions of professional trust struck at the very foundations of civilized society and required the strongest possible response from the judicial system. The recovery of stolen artifacts continued throughout the autumn, with items discovered in various hiding places around the village and others traced through the meticulous records of Dawlish and Brandt to private collectors who were compelled to return property obtained through fraudulent documentation, though the financial restitution, while substantial, could never fully compensate for the human cost of crimes that had destroyed innocent lives and shattered the trust that formed the bedrock of community relationships. Mrs. Bantry had thrown herself into organizing memorial services and the Christmas celebrations with determined energy that served both as tribute to the deceased and assertion that civilized behavior would ultimately triumph over chaos. Her renewed friendship with Miss Marple carrying a depth that had been absent from their earlier, more casual association, while the Rose Society voted unanimously to dedicate their annual show to the memory of Leonard Thorne and Mrs. Carmichael, a gesture that provided both memorial and affirmation that beauty and growth would continue despite the temporary triumph of evil over innocence. The church itself had undergone extensive security improvements under Mr. Finch's careful supervision, his once unshakable faith in the village's inherent goodness having been profoundly shaken by the systematic abuse of trust that had occurred within the very walls he so diligently guarded, leading him to check the church locks with thoroughness bordering on obsession, each turn of the key a silent acknowledgement of the fragility of security against premeditated malice. Reverend Clement, his gentle nature fortified by the ordeal, now preached sermons that spoke not of abstract sin, but of the very real presence of evil that could masquerade as virtue, his voice imbued with newfound depth of understanding for the darker complexities of the human heart, while Griselda reorganized the parish charity efforts with steely resolve, ensuring that no vulnerability could again be exploited by those who would prey on the community's good intentions. The arrival of spring brought renewal that seemed to encompass more than mere seasonal change, as if the village had successfully weathered a spiritual winter and emerged with greater appreciation for the bonds that connected neighbor to neighbor in the intricate web of rural life. Though conversation still carried a new weight, a subconscious calibration of trust and suspicion that had become an unavoidable consequence of Dr. Haydock's chilling exposure. The new organist, Mr. Timothy Hartwell, had proven himself both musically accomplished and personally reliable, his quiet dedication providing reassurance that the position would once again be filled with honor rather than exploited for criminal purposes. While the choir had grown under his direction, with several young people joining to create a blend of voices that seemed to embody the village's determination to build upon its foundations while learning from its painful experience with deception and betrayal. Mrs. Bantry arrived at Miss Marple's cottage one morning with a bicycle bell, newly polished and quite innocent-looking, but with a strip of grey curtain tape tied round its clamp, explaining that the gardener had found it caught in the hedge by the lich gate, and Miss Marple accepted it with a smile because certain little loops do close themselves at last, recognizing it as a kindly epilogue to the harsher music that had once shattered the village's peace with desperate warning. Miss Marple's role in the community had subtly evolved from pleasant elderly neighbor to unofficial guardian of village wisdom, her reputation for seeing through surface appearances having spread beyond St. Mary Mead to neighboring communities where her insights were increasingly sought when puzzling circumstances arose. Though she accepted this responsibility with characteristic grace, while maintaining her modest demeanor, understanding that her greatest strength lay not in dramatic pronouncements, but in patient observation and the gentle application of wisdom gained through decades of studying human nature in all its complexity. The case had reinforced her fundamental belief that the most dangerous criminals were often those whose position in society provided perfect camouflage for predatory behavior, while demonstrating once again that patient observation and gentle persistence could ultimately triumph over even the most sophisticated deception, transforming spaces that had been corrupted by greed into repositories of legitimate historical knowledge and ensuring that future generations would inherit both architectural treasures and the hard-won knowledge necessary to protect them from exploitation. As she sat in her garden during the long summer evenings, watching steam drift from her teacup and listening to the church bells ring with proper dignity at appropriate hours, Miss Marple reflected that while the immediate threat had been neutralized, the eternal struggle between good and evil remained a continuous, subtle dance, playing out in the smallest gestures and most profound decisions, requiring constant vigilance and gentle yet unwavering determination to seek out truth, however uncomfortable it might be. The village of St. Mary Mead had been forever changed by its encounter with systematic evil disguised as community service, but it had emerged stronger and wiser, its residents more appreciative of genuine virtue and more vigilant against those who would exploit trust for personal advantage, while the bells that had once rung before dawn in desperate warning now tolled with measured ceremony, their rhythms serving as eternal reminder that truth, however long delayed, would ultimately prevail over deception, and that justice, however gentle its methods, would always find a way to expose corruption and restore the moral order that formed the foundation of civilized life in communities where neighbors still cared enough to notice when something was amiss and courageous enough to act when action was required to protect the innocent from those who would prey upon their trust and goodwill.